The topic of this panel is the outlook for disruption. And it's funny that VJ was saying that innovation is perhaps the most overused word in the world. We were arguing backstage that maybe disruption is the most overused word in business because everything seems to be disrupted nowadays. And what we want to do in this session is really focus on what is the useful way of thinking about disruption? What is the kind of disruption that really matters, that needs to be handled differently from the sort of incremental day-to-day innovation and change that every company needs to do to stay competitive? And what are the major trends that we need to be looking out for? And I wanted to start with Jordan. Yeah, I mean, you're a futurologist and a trend spotter. So what to you does disruption mean? Is it an overused word?
It's dramatically overused. I see a lot of people swiping to the right out there, so the dating app's already working. How many people actually get the swiping to the right reference? You see already. It's working out really well. So yeah, I'm Jordan Brandt. I'm from
half the panel have to leave if they swipe the other way.
I'm from a company called Autodesk, and we're based in San Francisco, so we hear this word a lot. And fortunately, in San Francisco, it's not used as much because you can get beat up on the street if you say it out loud. I mean, honestly, it's a constant now. It's not something that you look at, what is the next disruption? You assume that every day there's going to be something that is a quote-unquote disruption. And you build a culture and environment that just deals with it and just becomes part of your DNA. I mean, you think
about... But if
it
is just part of your DNA, is it really disruption in a meaningful sense, or is that just what you deal with every day?
I mean, you're going to assume that there's going to be a competitor out there that has developed a new technology, or there's a completely new way to consume that maybe you're not meeting the demand now. And you build an environment in which it's managed, and you have creative people who are able to adapt to it constantly. I mean, I think if you look at disruption and more generally the term innovation, a good company makes them disappear in the sense that a good technology will disappear, right? We don't think about the lights that are around us. We don't think about the cars that got us here. We don't think about the phones in our pocket. Any sufficiently advanced technology disappears from essentially our eyes and our minds, and I think the same thing goes for disruption innovation.
And so if you had to pick for your company, what is the number one area that you think about most as being exposed to the kind of disruption that's going to be hard for you to handle and that you need to really think hard about?
The hardest thing to handle?
Yeah.
I think the way that things are actually designed and made, all the physical products around us, and looking at a world where people are empowered to actually design and make their own things is a big change potentially for us and for our traditional business model.
Yeah. Robert, I wanted to turn to you next. So you were nodding and shaking your head at various points during that. I mean, you were perhaps the most adamant backstage that disruption is an overused word.
Right.
What does it mean to you? How should it be used?
First of all, disruption as a concept is critical and transformative in terms of what you need to do about it. But the problem is we've got disruption with a small d, like in the dictionary, and disruption with a large D, which would be Clay Christensen's definition of disruption, which, if you read it, is very specific. And it's rather rigorous. And the problem is that people throw the disruption word on everything. And so if you're an entrepreneur, whatever you've got is disruptive. And if you're a corporation facing disruption, it's the stuff that comes in and messes up my business. So it becomes unuseful. So I think we're using the word disruption, the small d, like in the dictionary, for too many things. Now, the big D is critical, because that is, and I'm not going to go into the definition. If you don't recall the specific definition of it, look it up in Clay Christensen's work from the 1990s. But the reason that you have to handle it differently is that at the beginning of a disruptive process, if it really is disruptive, the incumbents go to their customers and they say, hey, do you want this new thing? And the customers, if it's truly disruptive, say, no, we don't want that. And so corporations say, oh, thank goodness, we don't have to worry, but that's not our business, that's not what we do, our incumbent customers don't want it. And then that's how it kills you in the long run, if it succeeds. So I totally agree that the word disruption is overused. The concept, though, remains critical.
And so as you look at the world, and you're obviously an academic and also an investor in venture capital, and you're in Indiegogo and various crowdfunding things and so forth.
Yeah.
I mean, what is the area that most interests you because it's not well understood at the moment, but
Great.
seems to be significant?
Great. So actually, a colleague at Kellogg and I, Andrew Rasky, are working on a book right now. And this is probably too early to share it, but this is the first time we've talked about this concept in public. So, before I say that, Matthew, I just want to say I've been on a few economist programs around the world, and you guys do a great job, and we're really happy you're here in Chicago. Please come back again. This is great.
Thank you.
So everybody's paying attention to the radical technology changes that are going on rapidly right now. So you mentioned crowdfunding, Internet of Things, big data, 3D printing, distributed energy generation, all of these, and I could go on, self-driving cars. All of these things seem like very different types of technologies. They have a variety of impacts in our economy. But it seems that while everyone's paying attention, very few have noticed an underlying impact that unifies all of these technologies. And that is a long-run trend that we're seeing accelerating right now. It's been going on for a while, but we're seeing accelerate, and it will play out over the next generation. And that is the production and provision of products and services closer and closer to the point of demand. I'm going to say that again. The production and provision of products and services closer and closer to the point of demand. So whether that's crowdfunding or Internet of Things or Uber-style supply and demand matching on a dynamic basis with mobile, 3D printing, something that Autodesk is deeply embedded in, all of these technologies have this underlying factor. So the last thing I'll say about it, we could talk more, but I'll shut up, is if you have a company, many of you do, I want you to think about your business. I want you to think about the value that your customers gain from buying what you've got, not the product itself, but the value they gain. And then say, if that value could be provided instantaneously at the moment it is needed, how would your industry look? And I guarantee you your industry will look radically different than it does today.
And it's this the point of sale economy, essentially, is it that everything shifts to...
Well, even the point of sale, Matthew, is shifting because my needs change. As my capabilities and opportunities change, the things I'm seeking change.
Now, Carolyn, you sit at this very interesting place at UI Labs between academia, business, and government. How does this word disruption work there, given you've got these three quite different constituencies that probably think about disruption in very different ways, and what does bringing them together actually change about that discussion?
Well, I'd like to think of disruption more like experimentation. And so we talk about disruption of technologies, but I think one of the things we try to enable at UI Labs by bringing these different stakeholder groups together in a neutral collaboration platform is experimentation or disruption of business models as well. So the way that we introduce new technologies, whether that's big data and analytics or cybersecurity, Internet of Things, computing, high-performance computing, this is changing the way we do business with each other. And so we need to experiment in that sense just as much as we do with how we use the technologies. And so our hypothesis, if you apply it to manufacturing, which is our first foray into collaboration among these diverse stakeholder groups, is connecting the various parts of the value chain together and doing it in a way that in some ways brings them closer together, digitally, but potentially physically as well. Brings the designers and the makers closer together, makes that process more efficient, perhaps disruptive, but it also gives them a safe way to experiment with one another in this collaboration platform.
And so what are the kind of things that you're seeing people experiment with? So
basically, UI Labs is designed to be a portfolio program. So the first program we have is a Digital Manufacturing and Design Innovation Institute. Our second program we just announced this week is CityWorks, which is focused on urban infrastructure innovation. And in both cases, we're seeing the effects of new sensing capabilities, high-performance computing, big data and analytics change the way that, again, these players are doing business. So if you take manufacturing, for example, the idea of manufacturability and designing for manufacturability interoperability, so that you're creating greater linkages between the designers and the makers by allowing them to exchange data that perhaps they weren't able to seamlessly transfer once before. Manufacturing creates more data than any other industry. However, it's what do you do with that data then? How do you actually turn it into information that allows you to make new business decisions? So how does the way a machine turns on a manufacturing floor, or the materials you might use, or the availability of a particular piece of equipment or a piece of material, changes the way the designer might think of their approach right from the start. You make those connections better, you can potentially lead to new innovative products.
Now, Marcus, I mean, you have one of the great jobs in the world of innovation as president of Bell Labs, which is a legendary long-term innovator. And you know, as you look at this notion of disruption from a company from a place that obviously has led innovation over the past century, but has also found itself disrupted in all sorts of ways as the company that's owned you, and you know, its viability has gone up and down over the years. How are you thinking about disruption at the moment?
Yeah, we think about it a lot. So those of you who don't know Bell Labs, it probably invented everything you own. No, that's a little bit of an oversight.
Marcus, if they don't know who Bell Labs is, they should probably
They
just
should probably just leave, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. But the laser, the transistor, Unix, C, C++, cellular technology, solar cells, I could go on. It's interesting, right? Because Bell Labs is 90 years old, which could make it a dinosaur. But it's got the benefit of looking at 90 years of disruption, because the job of Bell Labs was always disruption. I think all that's changed, and I do agree with your 2 Ds. I think there's little Ds we do all the time, and there are big Ds like those things like the transistor. Just to give you the number on the transistor, by the way, I looked this up recently. The number of transistors in the world, estimated, because quite hard to count, 1 sextillion. And that's an interesting word, but it actually turns out there's a real thing, which is amazing. It's 1 times 10 to the 21 transistors in the world. And if you actually look at what does that mean, it's 10 billion Milky Ways, which is fantastic, right? So that's disruption. That's a big D, I would argue. Yeah. So we've done that sort of disruption, and then we've done smaller things. So what is it we see? I think, honestly, the difference nowadays is the speed. That's the big thing that's changed for us. Before, when we were working under AT&T got to say, you will have the next disruption in 5 years from now. And we got to know that it was 5 years from now and deliver it on that timescale. And that's completely changed, because whoever it is, the big guys don't decide that anymore. Who decides it is, I think, consumers. And I think even in enterprises, we're adopting consumer behaviors. And essentially, the medium for that is through those devices you love, through the smartphone, the tablet, essentially. That's how consumerization of enterprise is driving enterprise to innovate at a rate that reflects consumer behavior. And as consumers, we're very fickle. We like things for 6 months, a year, 2 years. We don't like them for decades. Whereas enterprises are used to systems that last for decades. So I think what's really changed for us is that the innovation timescale across the board is dominated by consumer-type behaviors, whether it's your consumer, home life or your work life. And that's really challenging for anyone, because the big types of innovations like the transistor, take a bit of time to come up with. So I think for big innovation, matching consumer timeframes is hard. I think for soft innovation, widget, software platform innovation, where you can sort of try it out in the ecosystem and then let consumers iterate on that and improve it, I think you can do that fast. To create a transistor, an ecosystem around a transistor, is hard and takes much longer. So we wrestle with big D disruption, which takes a bit of time, particularly on hardware systems. Right. And then smaller disruptions that actually then emerge into the ecosystem and become big D. I think a Google is a big D, but it's done from a series of little Ds that then get bigger and bigger out in the ecosystem. And I think that one's hard for us, because our stuff was normally done behind closed doors and not actually launched into an ecosystem and then allowed to develop. So I think that's the wrestling. That's the thing we struggle with.
And as you think about the next big D that you are working on at Bell Labs, I mean, what is the equivalent of the transistor in terms of what could be a game-changing, massive earth-shaking innovation?
It's a great question. If I gave you a big D answer, we're working on the first quantum computing device called a qubit device. So think transistor is ones and zeros. That's all it does. Qubits is 1, 0, or I don't know. It's not quite like that. It's basically in a superposition of states that only collapse when you apply the right input function. So we're working on that device. We're doing quite well on that. That would be a huge D, right? Because you would change computing. In
Multi-dimensional D.
Exactly. It's a huge D, exactly. It's a multi-dimensional D. I like that one.
I like that.
And so that's the type of thing we still do because that's big D. But I think the interesting thing is the little Ds become big Ds. Because nowadays I think Autodesk and 3D printing, I would argue 3D printing started as a bit of a little D.
Yep.
It was using an inkjet printer just with different input media. Right?
But when you have enough people, enough critical mass, then that's when it becomes
It's a
the
big D. So I think that's the one where we're doing lots of things like that. But it's hard to say because the only way we'll know is those have to be launched into the market and an ecosystem has to appear around those. So lots of infrastructure stuff. You expect us to improve lasers and improve cellular and work on 5G and all sorts of stuff like that. But that's the stuff you expect from us. I think the difficult ones are to say, are we doing anything in the new world order that's sort of consumerish that could become a big D?
And how, I mean, just to stick with the quantum idea, I mean, how far off does that feel, and what will that change fundamentally if it happens?
How far off? We think within a year or two we could have that device. That device then has to be built into a computer. Those things, by the way, they have to be liquid helium cooled, so you won't be carrying one around anytime soon in tablet form. Liquid helium things are big and fill rooms, but they will be supercomputers that actually do lots of interesting things. They compute molecular structures, analyze essentially very complex systems that have multiple dimensions. You can collapse those quickly in a quantum computer. By the way, the two algorithms that have proven to be better than classical algorithms were both invented at Bell Labs. So you see, we do all this stuff. So a couple of years away, I would say, from the device, maybe 10 years away from the computer, that could be a huge disruption.
And then when
the entire approach, though, to formulating the problems is different now as well. So how do you instruct these machines to do a compute is a totally different.
It's totally different. So
way
there's
of
going to be a whole ecosystem around that.
So your sense is if you got to the quantum computer, I mean, that accelerates the whole of machine learning phenomena?
Yeah. What it's good at...
Automation of jobs and so forth?
It's good at answering very difficult problems, sorting problems, searching problems, where there's no structure to the data. So if you want to basically just collapse something, you sort of do a matrix diagonalization, for those of you who understand that stuff, it's good at doing that. So that's where molecular structure, drug design, et cetera. Quantum computers can be good at all that. But I think that's what you expect from us. So I think the more challenging thing for us is, can we actually compete with these guys? And not in a bad way, meaning outcompete, but compete in the same way where we launch something into an ecosystem and grow it externally, having the idea started internally, and profit from it. You could argue we did that with Unix. We did that with many of our innovations. The transistor went to Intel and Silicon Valley. But have we ever profited from that so that we can sustain ourselves? I think that's actually the difficult thing. And I think quantum computing will be one of those, because that device will be built into a computer by someone else.
Right.
And can we sustain ourselves with that?
Now, Jordan, I mean, one of the themes we hear a lot about when people talk about disruption at the moment is that we're now at this point where finally the Internet of Things, everything's connected.
Comes alive.
Right? Is that really, are we actually at that point? And
well,
what does that mean?
I think this folds into, so there's the Internet of Things and also the people using the Internet of Things. And we've been kind of touching on the fact that we say consumerization, or the empowerment of the consumer. I mean, in our own numbers, like we're a 25-year-old company and we have about 15 million professional users of our stuff. So like an engineer who's trained to use, or an architect who's trained to use the software. And we launched this consumer side design modeling applications, and suddenly we have over 200 million. It's like 250 million users now, like in a few years, right? So suddenly now people are more discretionary and people are better able to influence what they consume. And they're going to say, listen, enterprise, if you can't provide it, I'm going to do it myself, which is amazing time to be. And it also means now you're tapping into multi-billion with the big exponent number of neurons that are helping to design and make products. Now you couple that with the Internet of Things and them being able to directly feed back upon the products that are being consumed, and those products then modifying themselves based upon the response. I mean, we're getting into an age where we cannot predict what's going to happen next year. And this is what I'm saying, disruption has to become part of your ecosystem, because once you hit that critical mass, we have no idea what's going to happen a couple of years out, much less 10 years out.
But I mean, have we ever been able to predict what's going to happen next year, really? I mean,
well, like you said, in 5 years, you're going to have the next big disruption, right? So you have these planned attacks of what is the next big thing, and it's hard now to say what is the next big thing. We may not see it coming.
But give us a sense of the range of possibilities that you think about then in this area.
Well, I mean, let's go to the Internet of Things, and let's think about devices that we have now. We assume that, the phones already in our pocket are modifying all the time, and we don't know when they're going to update. Well, imagine if it's changing form suddenly based upon its usage and pattern, or maybe it's something that's designed to disappear and we don't even see it anymore. Our computing devices are embedded in everything around us. We don't have to carry the damn thing around, which I'm very anxious for that day. When
so wearables could all be a bit of a fad that
wearables, like it's part of your clothes. Just like I said, that good technologies disappear, and what happens when suddenly everything around you, this carpet, is communicating with the rug, which is communicating with your shoe, which is modifying your shoe, which is modifying the chip in your brain, right? I mean, it's really hard to predict that.
No one knows about the chip in my brain.
The secret's out now.
Matthew, I'd like to respond for a second to the notion of prediction, because that's a critical question, and I'm going to assert that it is a lot different today than it was 10 or 20 years ago. Now, we've never been able to accurately predict the future, even if we thought we could. But if you go back 20 years, we had a whole lot more people talked about cyclical industries, right? And you could sort of batten down the hatches, times are bad, we're batting down the hatches, cut costs, stay in the game, and then the industry comes back up and we start to make money again. There are numerous industries, energy is a big one, where that's not how it's operating now. Things are moving so fast, they're changing so quickly. So a friend of mine in New York in the media industry, Shelley Palmer, says, today is the slowest pace of change we will experience the rest of our lives. Yeah. And you think about the implications of that, it's shocking, it's scary, but it is true. So the notion of predicting is even less likely than it was in the past, and it's quantifiably the case.
I'd like to build on that, though, because I get asked this a lot, right? Can I predict the future? I liked your future, by the way. It was pretty cool. But I'm going to say I think we can, but actually it's a bit science fiction-y, which is actually what you sort of said, some science fiction there. But that is our future. I realize that 3D printing is actually no more than essentially the replicator in Star Trek.
Yeah.
Remember that thing?
Yeah.
The printed food, right? Mm-hmm. You went up to it and you said, I want this meal, and roast beef came out. But and then, the idea of immersive communication. Locally sourced, that's a good point, locally sourced. And then the idea of immersing yourself in an experience that adapts to you was the holodeck, right? That room you went into and you say, make this environment for me. I think to some extent we do know that's where we're going. That we recreate things locally. I think that's an excellent point, and I just want to point out why we do that, because it's a great observation, but why? Time. It saves us time, and yes, energy cost probably, because we don't ship it. Now, we send a digital file and then we recreate it locally. Yep. Is probably the most efficient thing you do, because you're not manufacturing with waste and with shipping cost. So we do things to save ourselves time. 3D printing saves us time. The holodeck saves us time in the travel to the experience. So I think the one great predictor is we are going to do things that save us time, and that's local. I very much agree with that. Recreation of goods and experiences that we can have locally, that we don't have to travel to be part of. We will still go to places, but we're going to do things that save us time. So my prediction for the future is saving time is the most important thing you can do, and then food, energy, water come along with that, because we need to live.
So if I can build on that, the idea of, I think saving time, even accelerating the whole innovation process, is something that we now have an opportunity to do if you think about the small d, big D. So our approach is to look at how do we get the right people around the table to really transform an industry? If you want to change the way that industry does manufacturing, you need to bring all these players together. And what we try to do then is identify what are the little D's along the way that ultimately make the big D happen. You take dinosaurs, if you will, these major industrial companies that have been around for decades, if not centuries. And how do you make that big D happen in that environment? The hypothesis for us is, well, we accelerate it by doing the little D's in between. And so I love the idea of the the time driver. And I think even the time driver is actually just important to the broader concept of innovation and disruption.
It's interesting. I mean, you sit there between government, academia, and business, and my sense is that in business now, even at the dinosaurs, there is a desperate effort to kind of embrace the notion of disruption, and everyone wants to be faster and sort of leaner and all those sorts of things that they're trying to do to speed things up and be flexible. Whereas, I mean, I guess academia feels like disruption, maybe, Coursera seemed like a threat for about a week or two, and now everyone thinks that's now over, and they can go back to their old ways. And government fundamentally seems impervious to the notion of disruption. Disruption just means paralysis rather than it just sort of sits there making things worse for everybody else. So is there any sign that's changing, and that the government in particular, because I interviewed Mark Andreessen a couple of years ago, and he was just saying we just avoid any business that's dependent on government doing anything better than it's doing at the moment, because it's just incapable of innovating in a positive way.
Should invite Jim back up here.
Yeah, exactly. You'd have something to say.
It's a really interesting question, and while that in itself is not necessarily what we're trying to solve for, I think we're seeing it happen anyway. So in the case of the Department of Defense, which is our primary investor on the manufacturing side, one of the reasons I think they were keen on looking at the type of collaboration that we put together is that we brought in companies like Procter & Gamble and Dow that I don't think of in the defense space. But what they recognized was they have the same challenges in manufacturing as we do. If you think of the Department of Defense as the customer rather than just the investor in what we're doing, and how would changing the way manufacturing is done affect a department that is, they are the customer. They are of incredible procurement demand. And so how can we make that easier for them? I think the locally sourced actually is part of it. How do you serve the warfighter in the field, for example? But it also means, how do I make sure that my legacy machines, my legacy tank is actually able to have the right materials, the right specs, be able to manipulate those specs for the current environment. And so I think there is this outlook of maybe we can make these investments in a calculated way to be able to make us think a little bit differently. I'll just quickly comment on the academic side. I think the pace, again, of innovation becomes very relevant here, because if you think about where typically university researchers get their funding, most often it's from the federal government, and it's at a very early stage in the innovation process. We need that. Basic research is absolutely key to, I think, our nation's competitiveness. But at the same time, innovation's happening faster and faster and not always happening at the university. And so how do you better pair the university community, incredible researchers and inventors, help them understand what the problem is that industry's facing, help them put them face to face with the customer in a way that is kind of done on a one-to-one basis today, but isn't really done in that many-to-many basis. And that's what we're trying to do, is kind of break down the barriers between them and kind of put them all
what
on
are you
the playground.
finding works and is working in doing that?
For us, we think that, and this is not going to be any major unveiling here, but defining the problem is half the issue as it relates to talking with the academic community and bridging that to the industry community. Because you oftentimes, again, if you're a university researcher, a national researcher, and you're trying to understand, how do I get funding for my research? You want to try to always put your research into the problem, square peg, round hole, and you're trying to figure out how to fit in what you do with the problem, without necessarily understanding what the problem is and maybe trying to think about it differently. Maybe a problem that a company like Caterpillar has is actually has a social science component to it. But unless you think about the problem differently, then you may not have that opportunity.
Yeah. There's a lot of good examples of tapping into the neurons of all the people around them, like glimmers of hope in the government with the DoD, as you said, as a procurement agency. They've tracked, starting with let's say post-World War II development and the cost of developing a new platform, right? From the SR-71 to the F-117 to all the cool new stuff that they do. And they basically predicted that by 2050, a single purchase of the equivalent of a jet fighter today would cost as much as their entire budget is today, like on the current cost curve that they're going. So they know that they have to drastically rewrite the way that they develop new platforms. And they've embraced crowdsourcing to design some of their new platforms. Yeah. And they're tapping into the expertise of the community And they realize that there's parts of that that are proprietary, but other parts that, developing a new drivetrain for a new vehicle does not have to be something that they do in skunkworks for billions of dollars.
So, Rob, I mean, you've invested in Indiegogo. I mean, I've been fascinated by this company called Quirky in New York, which is a crowd-sourced innovation company for consumer products that just I think is a fantastic.
It's very quirky.
Quirky company,
It's
it's producing great products and it's tapping the crowd in a really interesting way. I mean, how far along are we in terms of figuring out how to use the crowd, how to embed it in our disruption processes?
We're 32% away to the end.
32%.
32%.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And another interesting statistic, it turns out that 67% of all statistics shared on panels were made up on the spot. So, but no,
in this case,
that's a very good answer.
Yeah, okay. No, I mean, but that's actually a great question in that it brings together a lot of the things that we've talked about so far. So Autodesk is doing really exciting things supporting developers and product development designers, et cetera. I mean, I've actually heard from a number of people that you guys are in the forefront in terms of providing support for people, because you're building an ecosystem.
That's a recent change, by the way. That hasn't always necessarily been the case.
Absolutely, and they're noticing. So you're building an ecosystem, and then, Carolyn, what you're doing to bring different groups together to the problem. I mean, if we always look in the same places, we're liable to find the same answers. And this is what we face. Now, you mentioned that in academia you have to define the problem well. In fact, in academia, maybe we spend too much time on definitions, but that's what we're supposed to do. But I find that as well in a different way in industry and in other environments. And what happens, I see, in operating businesses, where we have to move fast, startups, big companies, doesn't matter, is we tend to converge on the solution too fast. We figure out what we think is going on, we come up with something and say, let's go do it. And we run at it. And the earlier you are in the innovation process, the more likely that first idea is not your best idea. And so we start to work on a solution before we even understand the problem. Now, how's this related to crowds? I think crowds, if you marshal them well, can help you understand problems in very different ways, whether that's a small curated group, crowd, a small group, or they can give you wisdom of thousands or even millions of people in new ways. Now, it doesn't make the decision for you, but it gives you a completely different way to define and approach the problems. And it's related to your comment earlier, Marcus, about how do we think about the behind closed doors stuff, and then when do we actually throw stuff into an ecosystem of some sort to get it to transition better?
I like your answer a lot. Yeah, if you think about it, to tie these things together, Bell Labs was just a small crowd. Right? The way Bell Labs worked is you had to move to New Jersey to be part of Bell Labs.
That's great from the start.
Yeah, right there, there's a bit of a barrier.
Yeah.
I moved there.
Yeah,
it's a lovely place.
All right.
But anyway, no, what it did is crowdsource into a one location, because that was the time where everyone had to co-reside, because there really weren't actually ways to collaborate at a distance then. But it was crowdsourcing. It had 2,000 people at crowdsource, and you could argue, do you need 2 million or is 2,000 enough? 2,000 is probably enough. I keep telling the team, don't complain about your size. You've got plenty of people. So that was crowdsourcing. You're absolutely right. And there, the idea was we crowdsourced people to challenge each other. So the first idea wasn't the one that succeeded because someone else was saying, your idea sucks. This is the right idea. Right. And it was that crowdsourcing phenomena. Yeah. Then the contact with the market, to both your points, that was through the parent company. When that parent company no longer owned the market, that's where the struggle begins, right? Yeah. But if you can reconnect with that market, and that's the thing we try to do, is find a way to connect those ideas with the market as a startup would, then there's no reason, and this is a lesson to you all, that you can't innovate internally within your companies and crowdsourcing externally. But you
so what are you doing at Bell in that sense then?
Well, we now have a small internal labs called FX Labs, Futurists Labs, that actually is taking some of ideas and presenting them to the market and saying, look, what if it looked like this? And they get to fiddle with it in a way that the company doesn't have to fully productize it first. We also invest in startups. We spend a lot of time with the venture capital community trying to actually see where there are resonant ideas. And then the other is, as I think, the parent company productizes a bunch of what we do, and they're more and more open to taking a bit of a risk there. Okay. So that's what we do. But I think these worlds are all the same. I would say university and student population trying to tie to the market is the same as are innovators trying to tie to the market, the same as startups trying to tie to the market. It's how you do it that changes. But in fact, they're always, nowadays, very similar. You need to access a market using a collection of innovators that is a bit more diverse than your closed room. And you just need to find a way of doing that that works for your particular setup.
Okay, so I'm going to turn over to the audience now, and we're going to start by asking the first of what's going to be a series throughout the day of polling questions to you. You can use your mobile phone or your, specifically you can use your Economist dating app as well to answer the question. The questions have been put together by PwC, and we're going to compare the answers we get from this audience with another survey they've done that looks at the same questions and others. So the first question is for all of you. Which of these approaches, the following approaches, do you think will lead to innovations that drive the most growth for your company?
It's a trick question, isn't it?
We have to answer this?
We don't, they do. So there are 5
We don't know
options.
the answers.
One is, option A is open innovation. Option B is individual freedom to conduct innovation projects, so that's giving employees the freedom to do it. C is design thinking. D is corporate venture groups. And E is incubators, corporate incubators.
You know, if I may for a second, I think this is indicative of the problem that we have, and this is to Rob's point, of that we too quickly assume that we have an answer, so we presuppose that there are answers to this. And the reality is, it's kind of like superposition. The answer is all of them simultaneously, right?
It is.
Sure.
The fact that we even say there's an option for one or the other, I think is misleading.
Let's see
already.
if you've influenced the answers here. Where everyone
In real time,
in real
right?
time.
Now everyone's retracting like, I'm not even going to vote. No vote is an option.
So this completely worthless answer that you just produced for is actually giving a lot of stress to individual freedom to conduct innovation projects and Google time and so forth.
But I would say market contact with that one. With any of these, market contact, solve a problem that is a real human need that saves humans time. That's actually, I mean, the thing is, it's not the mechanism by which you fund, it's the problem you solve, and that problem has to be one that has human
So let's
need.
just quickly look at the answer we got. We've seen our answer. What's the answer we got from the PwC got from 1,700 corporate executives that they interviewed? Are we going to see the answer?
It's exactly the same.
Wow, what a coincidence.
No, we haven't seen their answer yet. Are they going to put the answer up?
On this.
Or is that on that side?
Yes.
I believe it's up.
Yeah, it's this one over here.
Oh, okay. So we are less excited about open innovation
Than they are.
than they are. Okay, so
But they did say the individual freedom was still up there in the top 2.
I wonder if you took off individual, though, because I think to the point that Marcus was making, I mean, it really has to be very influenced. And so I think there's an interesting connection between open innovation and that freedom to conduct innovation projects.
Yeah.
I think the fact that both of those rose to the top, and both the PwC and the poll here, is telling.
and no one's terribly excited about corporate venture groups or incubators as
Well, but actually to everybody's, Carolyn and Jordan's point, I think from a corporation's perspective, I think, Mark, as you mentioned this, all of these are options that we should be considering, but it should be driven by our business objectives, and they're going to play different roles.
Yeah.
Okay, let's get some questions quickly from the audience. I'm conscious we're short on time, so let's take 2 or 3 questions. The lady at the front here on the right, the mic will come to you. Could you say who you are and just quickly
See,
ask
soon mics will be ubiquitous, you can just talk, and the chair will pick it up.
It'll go to your...
Well, he'll need a mic. We can just,
what a
the
disaster.
chip in my brain will just pick it up automatically.
Well, I'm actually, is it on?
Yeah.
Thinking of making a fake name, but I won't. I'm Catherine Mack, and I work for Fluor Corporation. We're an engineering procurement construction company. And I just wonder, with what you were saying about everything being closer, how does offshoring work with that?
When you say, so...
Offshoring services and things of that nature, because they
Right.
aren't closer to the customer.
That's
Okay,
a
so
great
we're
question.
going to take 2 or 3 questions because we're short on time. We got any other people in the audience that would like?
Well, we can't
There's
answer that one
gentleman-
first?
We'll take 2 or 3 at a time.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And then we're going to forget the first ones.
Hi there, my name's Anthony Ferrier from Cultivate, and I was interested in the conversation around disruption, and obviously, and in terms of the panel discussion that's coming later on this afternoon. But I'd be interested in your perspectives on a lot of this disruption traditionally has been driven by startup organisations, and so I want to understand your perspectives on, will that disruption start changing in terms of the larger organisations driving that disruption rather than responding to it?
Great. And we also had a third question that's been tweeted in, which is, please comment on how big data and knowledge management is going to affect how companies will do their innovation, R&D, and so forth. So who wants to take any of those three? So offshoring,
well, I think
startups, and big data.
Actually, this illustrates part of the point. I'm sorry I didn't get your name, but Catherine. So Catherine points out a dynamic that arose because of a lack of capabilities to achieve what I said in an ideal world. So for instance, if we had perfect 3D printing technology, which we don't, I get there are a lot of things we can't 3D print today. Someday we may or may not be able to. I happen to believe we'll be able to most things. But if at the time, 20, 30 years ago, when offshoring really got going, we had the ability to do it here cheaper and better, well, there's no way we would have considered going offshoring. So this is indicative of the fact that we did not have the technology capabilities and the behavioral patterns necessary to do it that way. But I'll give you an example of how this has been going on for a long time. And that was just-in-time inventory. Some of us might remember years ago when just-in-time inventory was a big deal. And basically, instead of having a huge inventory, I can have a smaller inventory, and I pass costs to my suppliers, who then have to figure out how to make just enough to get me what I need when I need it. But I still have an extended supply chain where I'm sending raw materials to parts of the world and then putting stuff on ships and saying, think about China. China is an entire economy optimized for scale production at a distance. What happens in 15 years when we're producing one of those things in my house or in my office when I need it? Mm-hmm. So this is what I'm saying.
Look at what just happened in the ports. The West Coast ports, there was a strike. They started rerouting ships through the Suez Canal, through the Panama Canal, and in a very not too distant future, that whole problem will be obviated. Yeah.
I think in a way Nike is a kind of leading edge company in this respect, which I guess they pushed everything out to China and all the sneakers were made there, and now they're going to be allowing you to basically print a shoe in a shop, aren't they? And in fact, you can already
and when the cost and value curve comes down, all those dynamics will change.
Yeah. I think now, what about big data? What do we think about big data?
I think big data is part of what's driving this time, more efficiency. So when you actually have the data to be able to make the decisions, well, in some ways closer to home, whether that's virtually, but you translate it into the physical world. Yeah. So yes, energy costs, and, fuel costs, and all that and labor costs are changing the way we're thinking about reshoring jobs. But I think data is a big piece of that as well. So as you can actually seamlessly exchange data among suppliers and the makers, now you have an opportunity to actually be able to make decisions in quicker fashion.
I heard someone say, I'm going to claim this as my quote now, because you're allowed to do that, because I don't remember the guy's name. So
it was probably me, Marcus.
It was probably you, because you've come up with some good stuff, I have to say.
Good.
We're entering the era of perfect knowledge. And that's what big data is meant to get us, is essentially, and I would argue it's actually small data that gets you perfect knowledge, big data just gets you noise. But if you could discern the meaning out of the data, then you would have perfect knowledge as the goal, which then, of course, the only reason for that is to save time. You can feel clever by being perfectly knowledgeable, but in fact, it's again to save you time and automate.
Now, what about this question of startups? I mean, are they, everyone here is most people here are probably from bigger companies. Is the startup still going to be the engine of disruption in the way that maybe Clayton Christensen argued it could be?
Yeah, but I'm going to say not the only one, right? Because everyone loves startups. I even love startups. But they're good at normally disrupting in one value dimension, one value chain, and then the most successful turn that into a platform. But there are very few who've turned it into a platform. Yeah. They're good at one value dimension. If you think about the Bell Labs type,
and that's why they're valuable, because they target this
thing. They're good
at
one thing, and then if they get good or they hire the right people, that becomes broader. Bell Labs and universities essentially do bigger disruptions than that, meaning we try and disrupt a whole world, if you think of the transistor, right? But that is a different type of disruption. So the trick is there's two types. There's the one value chain and grow it. There's the disrupt all value chains at the same time and go that big from the start. And I think those are the two models, and they will continue to exist. The clash between them is which has more value, because right now the money's a little bit too far over towards the startup side, not enough on perhaps the big disruption side. But those two worlds will always coexist, in my view.
Well, unfortunately, we're pretty much out of time, but I want to ask each of you to just end by sharing a bit about, what's the question that you're most wrestling with at the moment when you think about the future? Is there one thing that, you've all given areas where you feel confident, even if you're confident in your lack of certainty and so forth, but is there one question that you're just wrestling away with at the moment, trying to figure out, well, how big a deal is this? And Carolyn, maybe start with you.
This will coincide with the last conversation, which is, I think for me, thinking about the dynamics of ecosystems is one of the things we're trying to solve for in some ways. But I think that's what really is going to allow some of this disruption. It's all those players in the ecosystem coming together. So it's the startups, as you said, startups aren't the only answer. Startups are part of the answer, and bringing all the various stakeholder groups together in an ecosystem to drive new change.
Robert?
Great. Well, first of all, right now, I'm worried about how do I get one of these rugs? This is a really, if you haven't seen it, come up during the break.
Yeah.
You know what I said before?
Yeah, VJ's just launching the Economist store as well, that you can buy rugs,
By
tables.
the way, I have a name for that thing, the VJ's Datomatic. The question I mentioned before, how will this dynamic of production and provision of products and services closer and closer to the point of demand transform industries, and not just from startups, but from established enterprises? So just to tie to your magazine, you have a column called Schumpeter, which of course is named after Joe Schumpeter, and one of the greatest economists of the 20th century. And he asserted later in his career that big companies have the advantage when it comes to innovation. A lot of people have thought that he was wrong. I think we might see that changing.
Marcus?
I'll go with that. I can't improve on that. So there you go.
And we'll give the final word to you then, Jordan.
So we're all familiar with suspending our disbelief, like reading a good science fiction novel and you go along with the narrative. I think learning how to suspend our belief of what we think things should be and what the future should be.